So my name is Aaron Keyt, and in the year of composing in the wilderness, my wife and I were living in Anchorage. We're based in Seattle, but my wife had gotten a job with the court system there. I think she was largely concerned that I wouldn't have enough to do during her year. And she was the one who made contact with Steve Lias, found out about the program, and basically got me enrolled in it as a bit of a present for me during our summer there. So I enjoyed the opportunity to get up to Denali National Park with a group of wonderful composers, our wonderful leader, Steve Lias, and especially a huge call out to the National Park Service employees who devoted so much time to sharing their experiences, guiding us, keeping us safe, and just generally being wonderful people. I found the experience very interesting and maybe different from what you might expect from a name like Composing in the Wilderness, because we were packed together and not very far from the road system most of the time. So the experience that may be reflected a little bit in my music was that of a very concentrated and intense experience involving a lot of people, involving a lot of activity, rather than what I think people might think of in terms of a very reflective solo voice looking into the void.
My name is Nancy Hausle-Johnson. I'm a tiled mural artist in Fairbanks, Alaska. I worked as artist in the schools, 1% for art, been up to Coolidge Lake Field Station, and my stuff is in hospitals and schools. And I have a chance, I'm in this group called Elements, and we had a chance to work with the composers doing art to their music. And it's been a really wonderful experience. Looking at art in a different way. And I've also been doing it, working with art with scientists. It's a nice way to look at art.
Hello, my name is Mary B. Kaufman, and I am a painter in this process. I've spent 33 years in the Denali area guiding and teaching field studies and working with Alaska Geographic. I've been an artist on the road permit system. I have lived in Denali, so it's been a wonderful process for me to get involved with these musicians who have connected so intimately with the environment and with the whole process of living and being a part of Denali. For me, this process has given me a new sense of play and direction. I'm using a new medium, acrylics, and it's allowed me to be freer with my work. I do a lot of illustration work, so this has been really fun.
So my piece, Footprints, written for violin, bass clarinet, and cello, is a very short piece, about 3 minutes long, in three sections. So quite a lot goes on in a small amount of time, which I think was reflective of our experience in composing in the wilderness. The three sections deal with different aspects of Denali. The first section is called Antecedent River and was the very first idea I had in the piece, standing at the Teclanica River. I think our first evening in Denali, I was listening to the river and made some notes of the river's sounds and rhythms, a little ba-ba-bum, ba-bum-bum motif that the water was making. And that was the germ of the first section of the piece, which is intended in, I think, a fairly literal way to portray a mountain rising up from the antecedent river. The river has not carved the mountain. The river was already there, and the mountain rises up, which I think is a fascinating thing to envision and was intended to reflect the vast timescape that we see in Denali. The second section was also based on things we were learning from National Park Service employees about Denali, our wonderful hosts, and was inspired by focusing in on the very smallest aspect of Denali, focusing in on the flowers and fossilized footprints that one can see there. And so the second section is called Footprints, and it portrays simultaneously the footprints of bees in pollen and the the fossilized footprints of dinosaurs that we observed. So the very loud and the very soft, the very large and the very small, but back at the scale of living creatures. And again, the time span is something I wanted to reflect. The extreme ancientness of the dinosaurs and the absolute recentness of the bees right there in front of my eyes on the day that I'm there in the park. And then the final section was actually not written in Denali or conceived of in Denali. None of this was written in Denali. The whole piece was written in Coal Creek in the Yukon-Charlie National Preserve. The last section was inspired by the sound of wind blowing in the aspen trees. I was literally just relaxing in a hammock at our composing site, trying to figure out how to end my piece. And as I was listening to the wind blowing through the aspens, I realized that was the end. And I started making some notations of the way that sounded to me. So one of the things I was aiming for in my piece was a very literally programmatic approach, trying to depict the actual sound of wind in trees and the actual sound of a river, the actual thumping of a dinosaur. And at the same time, trying to convey the very human and subjective experience for me of the Composing in the Wilderness project, which is that we did an awful lot in a very short period of time. And I enjoyed playing with the idea of, in a 3-minute piece, trying to cram all of this in, because the experience was cramming a lot into a very couple days, a very short period of time in Denali, and a truly ridiculously short amount of time to write the piece. And so within this vision of eternity and grandeur is, I hope, a feeling of the hecticness that one feels of trying to absorb even a part of it in the very brief time that we have to experience it. And perhaps at a more metaphysical level, the contrast between ourselves as very small people, very small beings on this planet living a very short time compared to the very grand scale of Denali and Alaska and the planet as a whole. So that was what I was aiming at in composing the piece. I have a question for both of the artists. And the question I have for the artists, and either of you can take this, is that both of you, as I understand it, have lived for decades in this area. And in a sense, you're responding to composers like me who come up and spend a few days in your backyard and write about our experience. But you are responding to our experience out of the depths of your decades living in what we are writing about. And I'm wondering what that was like to you. In other words, your impressions of our necessarily very superficial impressions of your own home.
Well, I have to say that I felt there was a great deal of depth to your expression. And as it was the first piece that I worked on, I found it very expressive, and it gave me the opportunity to actually develop a process. For me, this was like the first voyage into this, painting through inspiration from music, and previous to that, I had done Christina Rusnack's, and it was just throw a canvas up and just listen to the music and then paint. And this just had, for me, depth to it. And I was able to read your words as well as look at the wonderful composition that you had sent, as well as, of course, I had my own background and understanding of the area, very specifically standing on the same gravel bar that you stood on at the Teklenika. And that connection was very strong for me. But in some respects, it was a very visual part of it. And it was a refreshing thing for me, more than I don't know that my background, I have to say that the first thing that I do when I listen to music is I sketch. And that is steeped in my understanding of design elements. But what happens is I listen to your music and I close my eyes and I start trying to physically move my hands and get a sense of what's going on in the music. And with my pencil in my hand, I start putting it down onto the page and start creating shapes. And the minute I open my eyes, the logical side of my brain says, okay, composition and line and form and that sort of thing. So it gives it a construct, but it is the music that drove me. The music is what I first connected to. And this is the sketching that I did to Aaron's piece during the process of it being played in Fairbanks. So it has the flow of line, and you can see kind of the tumbling and some of more erratic jumping spots, and just a whole, there's itty bitty marks up here that could be bee pollen. But the whole idea is just to kind of get that out on paper for me as an expression. And sometimes I'll go back to that when I'm finishing the piece, but that's the first step that I have. And that comes directly from your music. And that was the impact it had on me. And yeah, Denali is important to me, but visually and the sounds, but that music is what drove the line and the shape and color and texture. Thank you.
I think I'm a little bit more on the realistic, my image, but when I listened to the music, I was listening to the music and I was thinking of places in the park that it would be the same, that like when you were talking about the feel of the water eroding the land, I tried to think, okay, what would this shape be like, or what would it kind of do to the environment? And that's how I got the mountains with the water coming through, and because the water's forming the land, shaping the land, and the wind was supposed to be shaping it. And actually in my first piece, the wind was in there, but it cracked in the firing. And so the second time around, the wind got left out by accident. So, but the wind and the water formed the landscape that I was imagining, that I could see. And then I could see when the melody changed, and you were talking about I thought of wildlife. Then you said, because when you're talking about dinosaurs, these are the first animals, like the dinosaur leaving the tracks in the new form sand along the river, and the bees, they come in and they would be with the wind would be sending pollen and the wildflowers. So I just kind of used my imagination and thinking, okay, the spread of the wildflowers and putting wildflowers and color through there. Every time I do one, I keep thinking, oh, I would need to do this again because I get new ideas. But you get a time limit with how many times you could do it. But the music just inspired me on how I wanted to see it and what I was doing there. So I liked it.
Well, thank you.
It's my first time of ever composing art to music. So it was an interesting experience.
I could add additional, I was saying that you kind of gave me a structure, and it's interesting because it influenced the structure itself, because it's like 3 parts. First is the sketching, and then the second part would be actually looking at the structural elements and putting all of the information in front of me and writing and putting things down and studying things. And then the third part is actually developing the painting. As I was saying, ordinarily, I'm trying to get into this abstract mode, and acrylics has allowed me to do it because they're bright and vibrant and they dry fairly quickly. So in the third part, I'm trying to develop a scheme that makes sense from the music. And so I actually took it in 3 parts. So my footprints piece has the first antecedent characteristics, and then the second one moves into try to maintain a fluidity from one piece to the next. It includes the whole idea of the dinosaur footprints and the strong sounds that you have against the lightness of the bee pollen, and then it flows into the last piece, which has that just like, floating off with the wind. And that's how I developed it, based on your 3 parts to your piece. Mm-hmm. So it really helped me in my own work to define these 3 processes during the painting, because abstract work is not something that I ordinarily do. And so there was a, it hit me on many levels. But this connection with Denali was so strong through music, and I hope you realize that. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And the process with mine is when I'm working with the glazes, I come up with my ideas, I'll draw them up, and then when I'm putting down, the glaze is red, but it's going to come out green. My blue, it turns out it's really red. I mean, what I'm seeing is not what I'm going to get. It depends when it's fired in the kiln and it comes out. And I can only fire maybe twice without it breaking on me. So I'm learning to finger paint on tiles now and brush on stuff. I'm having a really good time trying some new things. Like the first one where the wind came to them, I had this really neat idea and it really worked great, but the whole thing cracked in half. And but it's really hard to actually see what you're getting because the glazes come out completely different. But that's the fun of it. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But that's kind of like with your music. You're sitting down trying out music and then you try out something else and then you get inspired by something else and you start putting it together. Yeah. And that's what makes it interesting.
Okay. One of the things I find interesting with this project is the different ways musicians, composers, and visual artists think in terms of abstraction and reality. Because, for you guys, you can respond to a landscape in a visual image that is quite clearly Denali or quite clearly an abstraction of it. We can use the word realistic or abstraction in a way that makes sense with visual art. And of course, for a composer, if I were to write a truly realistic sound portrait of Denali, a river, it's not going to sound like a clarinet or a bass clarinet or a cello. It's going to sound like noise. It's basically going to be a collection of noise instruments and rocks and water. I mean, you could be quite an accomplishment, but almost no one would say, oh, that sounds realistic. Our image in music of a realistic portrayal of a landscape is sometimes more along the lines of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. And, nature doesn't sound like that at all. And, realistically with a violin, with our instruments, I can't actually portray. All I can do is come up with analogies and metaphors. That's all any composer can really do, is what makes a person think of a mountain. And that's things like a grand ascending cello line. It's a metaphor that people can grasp. And so I'm in a sense kind of jealous of visual artists that we can more easily, I think, grasp what you're portraying and what you're trying to do, because realistically my composition could be a metaphor for anything a listener wants it to be. It's not tied. It is certainly tied in my mind, in my ear, to Denali in my experience, but I think without my telling people the program or describing it, if people just listen to it with no title or no background, no one would have. It would be unrealistic to expect a listener to have a clear idea that part of it is about a river, part of it is about bumblebees, part of it is about wind blowing through aspens. But as visual artists, I mean, Mary B, even in your abstract piece, one can see that it is an abstraction of mountains and water. And Nancy, your piece is, I can almost imagine the specific view we saw of that landscape. And I just find that a wonderful aspect of what you do.
It is. We're very lucky, to be able to have that visual component, and that is the challenge working for music. Is to take your sounds, your ideas, the instrumentation, and of course, you didn't necessarily get to choose your instrumentation, which is kind of interesting. I wonder if you would have chosen any other instruments, maybe drums, had you had the opportunity. And did this change how you choose instrumentation at all in your music?
So in my own music, I use chance operations all the time in my own composition, and I find that a very natural way to compose. Almost all of my music is about nature and about natural processes, and natural processes are not human beings planting aspen trees exactly 3 feet apart. Nature happens on its own agenda. and you deal with it as it comes. As you walk through a field in Denali, the growth is not put there to make it convenient or easy to walk on. The bear does not show up when you're hoping to take a picture of a bear. It does its own thing. You have to play the hand you're dealt. And so I use random processes as at various levels in every piece I compose. So having my instrumentation assigned randomly was a very natural thing to do. I often do that myself when I'm choosing pieces. Um, Although I'm usually writing for specific people, so that part's often set for me. But for instance, in this piece, not only was the instrumentation, I mean, literally drawn out of a hat for us, the quite a bit of the actual detail in the piece was composed by me using random processes. And a concrete example would be in the very last section of the wind blowing through the trees. That's a stochastic process in real life anyway. And I brought a set of dice up to me, and a lot of the specific notes and rhythms were randomly chosen. Because that actually frankly, it turns out to be an easier way to create a natural flowing effect similar to that of wind blowing through leaves, which doesn't follow the way a human brain thinks. It doesn't follow a narrative arc. It doesn't climax 2/3 of the way through. It does its own thing in its own time. And so I do routinely use those sorts of processes. I probably wouldn't have chosen the specific ensemble that I got. One of the challenges for it is it's very bass heavy. It's a treble instrument and two bass instruments, and Maya plays both clarinet and bass clarinet, but she's a bass clarinet specialist, and I wanted to write her a bass clarinet piece. So an immediate response, a difficulty I had in putting the piece together was the weightedness and the bass level. And that did affect some of my choices. That does make me think in terms of rivers and mountains, the deep sounds of those. It definitely inspired the dinosaur footprints. And so some of the specific things I decided to portray were based on what I thought could work with the instrumentation that I had. Yeah.
It was wonderful. And that, your music evokes feelings, and that's something that for me, I strive for in my art, but I'm always challenged by it. The sounds are so connected to feelings, it seems like, to emotions. So, yeah. And I think you nailed it.
I think of having you come up here and come out to the park and write. I mean, Mary B and I live up here, and we live here because we love it up here. And I love doing things of Alaska and the environment up here. When I was stuck in Santa Barbara, I was painting polar bears. I mean, I really like the North. And so for you to come in and write the music you did in the short time, it was really incredible to come in and pick up the feeling and be able to write a piece like that. So I think it was really nice.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I've written a bunch of Alaska pieces. One of the effects of our one official year in Alaska is I work with a nonprofit in Alaska now and do make annual trips up, both as a tourist but also a lot of business trips. And so I visited, at this point, quite a lot of Alaska, particularly native villages. And many of those have resulted in a little catalog of Alaska based pieces in my experience. And, many of which are actually in some ways more wilderness. I've been in a sense, more isolated places, more inside my own skin, inside my own self, with longer periods of time to meditate. This was very much an Iron Chef experience, as I think was probably discussed in the introduction. We had a very short period of time to compose with an actual performance deadline. And there's nothing that focuses the mind like knowing you're going to be executed in the morning. And that was the intensity of, I've never written a piece completely soup to nuts this quickly, or at least a piece of any depth other than just sort of album leaves or sketches. And so that was a very valuable aspect of the piece to get over. There's a tendency I think many artists have. I certainly have this of getting a little too self-indulgent. I'm going to wait for inspiration. I'm going to polish the stone for 6 months, and simply being forced to get the ideas out say everything you have to say very quickly and efficiently and then live with the results is an experience that as composers we at least the composers in the classical music world, we don't face. Theater music composers and commercial music composers deal with this all the time, and it's just an awe-inspiring skill to be able to write against these sorts of deadlines.
Mm.
We had far too short a time in Denali. It was just a handful of days to try to absorb something so deep and so vast.